Okay, so here we go. The ego, the id, and the superego. I was curious as to what you find on the internet with regard to Freud, and this is actually not that bad. I had seen my students use these before, and it tries to explain like how the ego, the id, and the superego operate. It doesn't do a really good job. I'll tell you why in a second, and it does show, though, these three levels of which Freud talked about: the conscious, the unconscious, and the preconscious. But I found this image that it's a little bit better. The idea of the iceberg, obviously, is that consciousness is just whatever we see and we're able to evidence, right? But according to Freud, there is way more to who we are and how we form our beliefs of who we are that is not at surface level. So a lot of people have talked about this idea that personality, according to Freud, is more like an iceberg than anything else. So part of what is showing here on the upper part of the diagram is the conscious personality that we have, those traits, ideas, feelings that I know I have. I know that I am the most disorganized person in the whole world, right? So it takes me a lot of time to be able to organize like my lesson plans or my apartment. You never want to go to my apartment. And if you visit my office, you'll see that there's like a lot of stuff there. That's at the conscious level. I know that. Also, I know a lot of things about myself at the conscious level, right? But for Freud, what becomes really interesting is that maybe there's a reason for why I am so disorganized. Maybe I'm just trying to be rebellious I knowing without me knowing that this is what I'm doing, right? The I, the ego, is not aware of what these other forces operating are doing. So that's why in this diagram, you're going to have like this idea of the conscious related to the ego. This is who I think I am. These are the traits that I know I have, and these are the reasons why I think I act in certain ways. The conscious part of the ego is guarded by the reality principle. I'll talk about the reality principle in a second. Separated from that conscious awareness of who I am, there's the pre-conscious. And if you remember, one of the first slides talked about the Freudian slip, right? There are some times that I say things that I didn't mean to say, but they somehow relate to my internal states. Freud was really interested in dreams. He has a book that's called The Interpretation of Dreams. And the reason why he is interested in that is because he thinks that those things that we remember from our dreams tell us a lot of what's happening in our unconscious. We don't have easy access to the unconscious, so whatever is in the unconscious will only be shown to us by this pre-conscious material, right? So the Freudian slip, when like I talk about my mother instead of saying another, or Freud has this really famous phrase, sometimes a cigar is only a cigar, because how he associated cigars and other things with phallic symbols. So what does it mean that we like to smoke or people like to smoke, right? So those are materials that are for the pre-conscious. When I dream and I remember part of my dream, if I had the expert tools, I would be able to analyze those dreams and get to what's working in my unconscious. One of my favorite moments using psychoanalysis was when I was talking to my mom, who is claustrophobic. So this is one of the reasons that, or this is one of the things that Freud patients would come to see him about. Like, I'm claustrophobic. I don't know why. Whenever I see a silver metal object on the floor, I just start having these anxiety attacks, right? So Freud would talk to them in his therapeutic method and try to figure out what was at the basis of that behavior. Because for him, claustrophobia is only a result of something else. So he'd say that he'd ask my mom, so tell me about your childhood and how these things began. And that's why I asked my mom. And not in that conversation, but in subsequent conversations, she told me that my great aunt used to lock her in a closet, like a really tiny closet that we had in our house. And she used to do this when my mom was like 3 or 4, and she would leave her there for hours and hours. So a psychoanalytic reading would say, you know what, there's no surprise that she developed claustrophobia. It's not actually a fear of, or an irrational fear of being in an enclosed space. It was conditioned by the experiences that she had. So this unconscious is going to be well below the surface, right? This is not something that I can access on my own. This is why Freud thinks that we need a therapist. So that unconscious is related to the id. The id is this more instinctual driven part of who we are, and it is regulated by the pleasure principle, and I'll talk about the pleasure principle in a second. But Freud used to look at he used to observe his grandson to talk about the id and how the id aims to incorporate everything that is pleasurable and tries to do away with everything that is painful, right? So we seek those things that are going to enhance our experience, that are going to make us feel better. And we try to put away things that are not really that pleasant. So we have the ego, which is how I refer to myself. The it, that are those pleasure principle items that I have within me, like all these fantasies about incorporation, eating, and whatnot, uh, and the superego. And the superego is going to be especially important for us because in Civilization and Discontent, this is what he talks about, right? The superego is what I imagine or what I have been told that I can be. So it's like this ethical part that Freud wonders how we came up with these ideas, right? So I'm not going to talk too much about the superego right now because that's part of chapter 8, but these are the principal ideas that exist in Freudian theory. And again, this is just a snippet of the theory because he talks about the id, the ego, and the superego in multiple works, and they're not always the same. There are slight variations. So these are just concepts or definitions that we can have handy for understanding what's going on in civilization and its discontent. So the reason why Freud wants us to talk about these things is because he understands that we are regulated by things that maybe we don't understand, and we try to put labels to those things, right? So one of the things that he thinks he discovered is this idea of the pleasure principle versus a reality principle. So I had mentioned this before, right? The pleasure principle is going to be whatever brings me sensations of well-being, and I'm going to try to I start wanting to not have painful responses, but pain and pleasure come from the same kind of source. The pleasure principle wants me to investigate the world, and what I find out there are these sensations, right? As he says in civilization is discontent, these frequent, manifold, and unavoidable sensations of pain and unpleasure. So the pleasure principle surrounds me at every point. This is, I think, one of the most interesting things that we have learned with autism. One of the differences between a person who has autism and somebody who doesn't has it is that a person with autism doesn't control, in Freudian lingo, doesn't control the pleasure principle. They can't turn in, they can't turn on or off the sensations that they have, whereas we pretty much can control them, right? So the pleasure principle is sort of like my it versus the outside. And this outside, of which I don't quite know much when I'm just embedded in the pleasure principle, is described to us as the reality principle. So in the reality principle, I get to decide what it is that I want to intake, what sort of emotion I want to be experiencing, which sort of experience I want to pay attention to, right? So, as a pleasure principle, I could have this fantasy of having an affair with, I don't know, one of my colleagues, right? And I can go home and think about it, and I can have all these thoughts about like what I would do if we were ever in the same room and it's only the two of us, blah, 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 blah. But the reality principle would kick in, and even if I'm alone with this person, I wouldn't act on it, right? Because there are demands that are put on me. So it's not exactly, this is what the quote refers to, right? It's not exactly that I can differentiate between what's internal and what's external, because I don't know how much of that reality principle is something that I developed and how much of that reality principle is something that was said to me that I shouldn't act on those desires, right? So, pleasure principle are the desires that we have. Reality principle is how we cope with those desires, which ones we decide. It's a decision making principle, which ones we decide to enact, right? So, for for Freud, this becomes really interesting because the pleasure principle and the reality principle are going to be this battle between what the it wants and what it can actually get. So I get to recognize myself by these demands and restrictions that I get. And the demands or the desires that I have, I'm going to call them the pleasure principle. And the things that are negative, that are forming me, or informing me of what I can and cannot do, are going to be the reality principle, right? So to me, that sounds a little bit like Hegel in a more applicable way, but Freud wants to say that there's that sort of fight between the pleasure principle and the reality principle doesn't totally get resolved. It gets shrunken, right? There's a residue of this way of trying to incorporate, trying to create an intimate bond between me and the world in which I am. And because I can't always do it, I create the idea of religion. I create this ancient map that tracks the desires that I wanted to have, something that is still prescribed within the memory of a people that comes through in this religious feeling, right? So this religious feeling is what makes us believe that there's an authority that is beyond us. It's not because we can prove that there's an authority beyond us, but it's because we're afraid of the world in which we live and how to express it, how to better understand it, that we give an external voice this religious authority over us, which is later on in Freud going to become the superego or the cultural superego. We'll get to that in a second.